Hello, everybody. Hi, teachers. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on when and where you're visiting us, viewing us from. Welcome, everybody, to this month's webinar. It's nice to be back with you again. My name is Janine Matz, and I'm an English language specialist for RELO Andes. So today our topic is one that's quite requested by a lot of you. So we're going to take a look at assessing assessment. Evaluation in the EFL Classroom. As everybody starts joining the session, please introduce yourselves in the chat, interact with us, tell us where you're from, what grades you teach, which ages. Let's get to know each other a little bit during this session through the chat. Okay, so to start this afternoon, I would like to ask you to please interpret this statement. So assessment isn't an endpoint. It's a compass that guides instruction. Think about this for a moment. Let's reflect on this statement. Hello, Santi. Thank you for joining us as usual, faithful follower. Nice to see you. So how would you interpret this statement? Assessment isn't an endpoint. It's a compass that guides instruction. What do we mean by this? Hello, Ludita from Cuenca. Thank you for joining us. Yes. Okay, let's think. What do we mean by this? So Santi tells us we never stop learning. This is definitely true, right? Even us as teachers, some of the best teachers are always aware that we're always learning. We have so much more to learn, right? Yes, that's definitely true. But as far as assessment goes, what do we mean that it's not an end point, but rather a compass that guides instruction? Maybe we can interpret this as a lot of times in our EFL classrooms, we use assessment like just at the end of a unit or at the end of a chapter or at the end of a semester, we tend to use assessment, right? But what we're suggesting here is that it's not just an endpoint. It's actually a compass that helps us to guide our instruction. A compass, as we know, right, is an instrument that indicates north, south, east, west. So how is assessment like a compass? Well, because it kind of gives us some type of direction, which way we should go with our students. Is there something that's difficult for them? Is there something challenging? Do we need to rework some things? So it really is an indication of how we can move forward with our students in the teaching learning process. Hello, everybody who's just joining us. Hi, Alicia, Jenny, Karin. Thank you for joining us today. Nice to see you from Bolivia, from Peru, from all over. Great. Okay. So we have to define what assessment is. What is assessment? We can define assessment as a systematic process of collecting evidence of student learning. But this is not limited to just written or oral tests. We can also look at observations, products, performances, conversations, reflections, and a lot of other options. Please tell us in the chat, what other activities do you use for assessment with your students? I see some are still joining. Carlos, nice to see you. Thank you for being here. Karen says, assessment is a compass that guides instruction because it helps us to identify important points to give feedback to students. Absolutely, it helps us gauge how our students are doing with what we're teaching them. That's very important. Thank you. Okay. Hello, Alfredo, who is just joining us as well. Okay, so central to designing effective assessment is using what we call a backward design approach. I would like to know of those of you who are joining us right now, have you worked with backward design before? And how was the experience? If you have worked with it, did it work well in your context? Let us know in the chat. How was the experience? For some of you, maybe backward design is a new thing, which is great. Yeah. For some of you, you might have already used it in your classroom. So let us know what your experience has been with backward design. Okay, because if we start with backward design, we can construct assessments that are more effective. for us to gauge how our students are doing, and also for our students, okay? Eliberto, nice to see you again from Venezuela. Thank you for being here today. Okay, Santi says she's never done backward design. That's cool. This could be something new for you, Santi. That's good. Okay, the rest of you, if you've ever worked with backward design, go ahead and comment in the chat for us. While you're commenting, we're going to look at the backward design framework. So if you're not too familiar about this way of constructing units, we can take a look at how we actually do it. So we can start with identifying our desired results. We already see how this is backwards, right? Because we're already looking at results first. Okay, so identify desired results. What does this mean? It means, what should students understand and be able to do? We can base this on standards like Common European Framework of Reference standards, or particular learning goals that we may have at our institution or in our English programs, or national curriculum goals. I know that in the case of Ecuador, where I live, and also in the case of Peru that I'm familiar with, and I'm sure other countries in the region and around the world have national curricula for English. And in those national curricula, many times we have standards, or we have goals or skills or something that we want to reach, right? And then we have indicators for those skills. Yeah, so we can look to our national curriculum in many cases for these desired results as well. Charo, nice to see you from Bolivia. Thank you for being here. Okay, then we can determine the acceptable evidence that will help us determine if our students have reached those desired results. So in other words, how will we know if they've learned the material? What type of activity or activities can show us that? What kind of evidence will be good to determine if they've reached these goals? Yeah, in a lot of times in the curriculum, we can look to our indicators. What indicators, what type of evidence can show us the indicators? Yeah, and then after we determine those things is actually when we start planning our classes. What usually happens in a traditional classroom is that we do it the other way. We start planning our classes, and then we think of what evaluation evidence we can use, and then we determine if they have achieved a result, right? But what we're suggesting with backward design is that we do it flipped, the reverse. Yeah. So we plan our classes and our learning experiences, instruction with activities and strategies that prepare students for the assessment, which is the tool that we're going to use to determine if they have in fact reached the desired results. Do you see how this works? Except we're thinking about it backwards. Diana, thank you for joining us today. She says the teachers start with the outcomes in mind in this approach. Exactly. What's my goal? Now I'm going to work backwards to get to that goal. Exactly. Okay, so that's the backward design framework. So let's look at this a little bit more in detail so that we can understand how assessment fits in. So in step 1, we identify the learning outcomes. So some characteristics of some strong outcomes or indicators are aligned to the Common European Framework of Reference or local standards, like we were saying, the national curriculum, for example. They are specific, observable, and measurable. And this is very important because they must be measurable because the measurement is gained through the assessment. Yeah, so it must be an outcome that we can somehow show through the evidence, the assessment that we will give students. It focuses on language performance, not just vague abilities. We'll look at an example in a moment that will make this more clear. And also we can use verbs like describe, explain, identify, summarize, compare, narrate, ask, answer, etc. So if you are in a situation where, for example, you're teaching at a private institute or you're teaching in some other context that does not have a document like a national curriculum to abide by, you can create your own outcomes. Here is an example of a poor outcome, one that does not work well. Students will understand past tense. Now, why do we say this is a poor example of a learning outcome. What is wrong with this example, the poor example? Students will understand past tense. If we analyze that from the characteristics of strong outcomes, what's wrong with this one? Exactly. Thank you, Eliberto. It's too general. They'll understand past tense. It's vague. Past tense. Okay, what past tense? Right? And then how are we going to measure that they understand past tense? How do we measure this understanding past tense? That seems challenging, right? So we can turn it into a better example, like students will describe a past event using 4 to 5 past tense verbs, for example. We see how this is more specific and more concrete. Yeah? Okay. Let's look at the next slide. So here are some more examples of some strong outcomes that we can use with our students. You'll notice that these are competence-based, and I know that a lot of curricula in the region are now working with competences, right? So we can break down our outcomes into different competences. So for example, a reading outcome can be students will identify the main idea and 2 key details of a B1 level text. You see, this is oriented around the Common European Framework. A writing outcome, for example, could be students will write a 120-word opinion paragraph with a clear claim and 2 supporting ideas. Okay, a speaking outcome. Students will narrate a personal experience using temporal connectors like first, then, after, etc. Or the listening outcome. Students will respond to 4 comprehension questions after a short A2 audio clip. Okay, this is another example. Okay. Step 2, determining acceptable evidence. So we can use some questions to guide teachers. For example, what performance would convince you that students achieved the outcome? In other words, what can students do to show me that they have reached this goal? What can I have them do? What product or action provides evidence? How will you judge quality? What criteria will you use? If I'm on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the best, what constitutes a 10? What constitutes a 7? Right? These are some questions that can help guide us to determining acceptable evidence. And then we have many different types. And here I would like you to please comment on what evidence you've worked with for assessment. So here are just a few ideas: some performance tasks, some speaking recordings, some responses to comprehension questions, either from a listening or reading passage, checklists, journals, exit tickets. We're going to talk more about these specifically in a little bit. Quizzes and tests when appropriate. Are there other types of accepted evidence that you would work with? What other types of evidence would you work with? Let us know in the chat, please. Let us know. Okay. So we also need to match evidence to outcomes. So if we have an outcome, for example, you have describe a weekend activity. Okay, this is my outcome, to be able to describe a weekend activity. What is a possible piece of evidence that can show me that a student is able to do that? We can ask them for example, a 1-minute recorded speaking task, for example. If our outcome is identify the main idea of a text, our evidence can be something like 2 multiple choice and 1 open-ended question. These are just some suggestions. You can think of others as well. There's not only one possible piece of evidence for every task, for every outcome. Perhaps there are more. Another outcome example could be use comparatives to describe 2 cities. And the evidence can be a written paragraph comparing two photos of two different cities in this case. We can have an outcome like participate in a simple A2 conversation. The evidence can be a 3-minute pair dialogue, for example. Yeah. So we always need to make sure that the assessment or the evidence in this case matches the outcome. It's relevant to the outcome. Okay. Yes. Yes. Santi asks a question. In order to assess outcomes, can we use rubrics? Absolutely, for the productive skills. Yes, like speaking and writing. And we're going to get to rubrics at the end of this webinar today. So we'll take a look at those specifically in a few minutes. Okay. And then finally, working backwards, right, we can plan instruction. So instruction prepares students for the kind of evidence that they will produce. This can include modeling, for example, where we demonstrate a speaking sample or whatever it is that we're going to assess. We can use scaffolding. I know many of you are familiar with scaffolding, where you use sentence frames, vocabulary banks, etc. We can use guided practice and then independent practice. So at the beginning, give them more of that scaffolding, more direction, and then let them work a little more independently. We can use sequencing activities to build the target skill, start from smaller steps and then go to bigger. So for example, if I want my students to write a descriptive paragraph or something, and I want them to describe their house or the place where they live, I can start before the writing assessment, I can do a model paragraph. We can analyze it. We can do guided writing, where I break down the writing process into smaller pieces. Okay, first, think about your topic sentence. Then think about 3 adjectives that describe your house, where I break it down, right? And then we can move on to independent writing. You see the process, how it moves along? Okay. Okay. It's very important when we talk about assessment that assessment mirror instruction. This is important for several reasons. For validity and fairness, first of all, first and foremost. This means that we need to create an assessment that students are comfortable with because it's what they've been doing in class. And this seems kind of obvious, right? But not always. So if we do validity and fairness, students should be assessed using the same types of tasks they worked with. This is what we call the washback effect. The washback effect is precisely that the types of activities that students do in class and the types of activities they are asked to do for their assessment mirror each other. In other words, if you are teaching communicatively in your classroom, then we should also be testing communicatively, right? We should not be teaching communicatively and then asking our students to do a verb chart for the test, because that's not the way that they've been instructed in class. So the types of activities we do, not only the content, but also the type of activity should mirror the types of activities that we have done in the classroom. So here are some examples of mismatches where it doesn't really go together. If I'm teaching vocabulary using flashcards with the English word on one side and then a picture or description in English on the other side, I'm not going to assess that using a debate. In the same way, if I teach reading strategies in my classes, if I'm focusing an entire week on reading strategies, like for example, skimming, scanning, things like that, I'm not going to assess that using verb conjugations, right? I have to make sure that both the content and the way the content has been worked with are also apparent in the assessment, that they're the same type, okay? Yes, hello to everybody who is just joining us. Thank you for being here. Okay, I'm sure some of you, excuse me, there is a storm happening in Quito, Ecuador right now, so you may hear some thunder in the background, but I'm sure some of you have worked already with formative and summative assessment. If you'd like to tell me, please, in the chat, as we're comparing the two, what has been your experience with formative and summative assessment, how you use these in your classroom, please comment in the chat and let us know. But to make the distinction, the general distinction between formative and summative assessment, we can see that in formative assessment, this happens during learning, yeah? During learning, whereas summative assessment happens at the end of the unit, right? So formative is quite frequently as they're learning new vocabulary, new grammar, they're working with reading, the skills, etc. And summative is at the end. Formative tends to be low stakes. What do we mean by low stakes? Means less pressure, yeah, less pressure. Not as stressful a lot of times for students. Whereas summative assessment tends to be higher stakes. In other words, it's more important a lot of times in their average, in their final grade. Yeah, summative assessment is important. Yes, teachers, please tell us how you have used formative and summative assessment in the classroom. Okay, formative assessment guides teaching. It helps us, remember that compass idea from the beginning? Yeah, so it helps us to get an idea of what direction we're going, right? Okay. Whereas summative assessment measures achievement. It measures achievement. We've gone through the whole unit. Now I want to see what you have achieved, right? Formative assessment is frequent and quick, whereas summative assessment tends to be less frequent. And formative assessment examples are things like exit tickets, checklists, and others, which we will look at on the next slide. And summative assessments are usually tests and presentations and things that are usually more elaborated, right? Yes, Eliberto, formative is to see the progress throughout the unit. Exactly, that's good. Yes, Santi says, I like formative assessment because I help students build their learning process step by step without waiting at the end of the semester, which sometimes is too late. Absolutely. Formative assessment helps us to determine what problems, what difficulties are my students having right now, and I can help them. I can work those before we get to the summative assessment. Exactly. Yes. Okay. Melissa says, I prefer formative assessments. I use observation forms for every class. That's amazing dedication. Awesome. Thank you so much. Yes. Eliberto says, summative, give them a mark. Yeah, it's for a grade. And Jenny says, for formative assessment, I try to use puzzles, board games with checklists. I think puzzles and board games really help to lower the affective filter of our students and are great techniques to have them give us an idea of where they are and also allow them to have fun as well. So that's great. Okay, here are some suggestions for formative assessment tools. So for example, we have something that's called an exit ticket. What is an exit ticket? It's literally a little ticket that our students write up that it allows them to be able to leave the class. So depending on what we want them to do, we can ask them, okay, use one new word you learned today in a sentence. If we've been focusing a lot on vocabulary. We can also ask them, what part of the lesson was hardest? Comment that on your exit ticket. Give an example of a comparative adjective. We can even do it as an emoji. We can make emoji exit tickets. Draw an emoji on your ticket and explain why you chose that so we can see how they're feeling. Yeah, this is also a great approach. And literally, it's a tiny piece of paper that the students give you as they exit the classroom. And that is their ticket to leave your class. And then from all of those little tickets, you can get a general idea of how students are doing with the lesson, right? Okay, we have some more comments here in the chat. Thank you, Lourdes, for commenting. At school, we use formative assessment to record students' progress and achievement, taking into consideration a student's evidence and using evaluation instruments such as rubrics, checklists, exit tickets. Exactly. Dani says, I think both are important. And now there are many ways of making our summative assessments more interesting, for sure. We don't want students to be afraid of assessment. We don't want them to associate assessment always with something stressful, negative, and a lot of pressure. No, we can do things like formative assessment where they feel more comfortable. We can do quick checks, which is the next one we have on the slide here. For example, we can do thumbs up, sideways, or down. So we ask the students, for example, how do you feel about comparatives in English? How are you feeling? Thumbs up, thumbs sideways, so, or thumbs down, I don't feel comfortable yet, right? We can do that. That takes us what, 10 seconds? Yeah, and then we could do hold up a mini vocabulary card if we're working with vocabulary. We could do mini whiteboards. Some schools have little whiteboards that their students can write on. We can work with those. We can do what we call a quick turn and talk. In other words, I give my students 30 seconds and I say, okay, for 30 seconds, turn and talk to your partner about whatever it is that we were talking about in class, right? Where students can do that. Okay, we have one sentence summary, for example, where I ask them to summarize the class in one sentence. We could use digital polls. If you'd like to work with technology, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Mentimeter. If you're not, you can look up Mentimeter. It's very user-friendly. We can create a word cloud. We can create a poll on Mentimeter. So we can do all of these things, even involving technology as part of formative assessments. Yes. Okay. We can do mini conferences with our students. In other words, the teacher listens to the student's explanation, asks a targeted question, and gives one clear next step suggestion, right? This is a conference where we do one-on-one. We exchange really quickly with each student, but like 30 seconds, right? If the student says, for example, teacher, I feel like I'm having trouble with this part. You say, okay, you know what? I suggest you do this. Go home and try this. Yeah, where we can have that dialogue, that mini dialogue. We can also use something like checklists where we have, like, for example, if we have a speaking checklist, I can check if each of the students uses topic vocabulary, if they speak clearly, if they include 3 to 4 key details, if they use the verb tense, etc. But not grading with a rubric, just making sure that they are doing these things as a checklist, right? These are all different forms of formative assessment tools. If you used something else, please let us know in the chat what other assessment tools you have worked with. But these formative assessments are just as important as the summative assessment. They are just as important because they are a great tool for us to see how our class is going. And it's a great tool for our students as well, because then they can identify where they're having trouble before they get to the summative assessment, which is to their benefit. Okay, so let us know in the chat, please, teachers. Have you used any of these formative assessment tools? Which ones would you like to try in the future? Let us know. Tell us which ones have been successful for you. Which ones have worked well for you? How do your students react to these tools? Let us know. Okay, so Eliberto says waiting tables. That's really interesting. If you want to give a little elaboration in the chat, that would be wonderful for us. Thank you. Okay, let us know which ones of these you have used before. Okay, then we have summative assessments. Summative assessments we use usually at the end of a unit, at the end of a quarter, a trimester, a semester, etc. Yes. Anita, thank you for being here. I would like to try turn and talk. Those are really fun. Students like to do those. Yes. Let us know what happens when you try it. Okay, so some examples of summative assessments are speeches and oral presentations, paragraphs, essays, email writing tasks, reading comprehension tests. Those can look like multiple choice, fill in the blank, short answer, short essay, depending on your context, right? We can do listening tasks that also involve filling in the blank, multiple choice, short answer, etc. Projects, brochures, posters, videos. A lot of us in the region are working with project-based learning, right? So we can involve projects as part of our summative assessments. We can work with portfolios. We can have students collect work, and then present a whole portfolio at the end of a unit. What other summative assessments have you guys used? Let us know. So Martita says a checklist is an instrument that helps us to know information and gives us qualitative assessment. Okay, a checklist can give us quantitative assessment, right? Because it can give us how many of these 10 items are my students getting, right? But we can also perhaps give qualitative assessment as well. Gustavo says some of them have been tried in class successfully. Exit tickets, for example, adds just the right amount of pressure to obtain the right amount of focus. Good. Yes, it holds our students accountable for each class. It's not just attending class and then I go home. No, I'm holding my students accountable, and that's very important for their development, their academic development, and also their personal development. So this is good. Thank you, Gustavo, for your comment. Okay, I want to go a little bit into portfolios because portfolios can be very beneficial for our students. A portfolio can be beneficial for different reasons. For one reason, students are able to see their progress, right? They're able to see what they're able to do in the language and how far they have come since the beginning of the quarter, the semester, the school year, and that builds their confidence. They say, look at what I did 5 months ago and look at what I can do now. And this is super beneficial for their growth and for them to feel more comfortable in the language. Here are some things that we can include in the portfolios. And Anita, since you love portfolios, please feel free to let us know what things you have included for your students' portfolios. But here are some ideas. Their first writing sample and their last writing sample. At the beginning of the school year versus the end of the school year. Students really like to look back on these things. So if we can include a first writing sample and then the last one they do, they will see how far they have come. A recording of speaking over time. For example, we can use WhatsApp to record speaking to send audios to people, right? They can have a recording of their speaking the first day of class and the last day of class. We can do reflection pages. Those same students reflect on what they've done, how they've improved over time. Their teacher's feedback. We can say at the beginning, I remember you could not form a sentence yet in English. And now look at you. You're writing whole paragraphs in English by yourself. Things like that. Self-assessment rubrics have students, again, reflect on their own performance. How was I doing 5 months ago? How am I doing now? Any other evidence of improvement in the language? And why do portfolios work as assessment? Why are they effective? Because precisely what we've been mentioning, they show progress. It's not just a score on a single day. We all have bad days, right? Sometimes we go into a test and we freeze. We forget everything. We have anxiety. We're stressed out. We didn't sleep the night before. We have personal problems that we can't stop thinking about. Whatever the situation, there are some days in which we do not perform our best. But a portfolio allows us to get a panoramic view of how students actually can perform. Yes. Okay. All right, here's the part about rubrics, which Santi mentioned to us earlier, how we can use rubrics. Okay, let's think for a moment what we use rubrics to evaluate. Rubrics we use to evaluate things that students produce. So the productive skills in English, which are speaking and writing. The receptive skills, listening and reading, we don't usually use rubrics because how would we use a rubric for listening? Like what categories would we include? Okay, does the student understand the listening? Okay, that's one category. But it's kind of hard to think of how we would develop a rubric for listening, right? But for this productive skills like speaking and writing, we can use rubrics. Why do we use rubrics anyway? It's to turn a grading process that is quite subjective into something that is more objective. If I have clear categories and clear point values for those categories, I'm able to make the score at least more objective. So they matter because they make expectations clear. I socialize my rubrics before I give them to my students. Before I use them with my students, I socialize them. Look, here's what you're going to be evaluated on so that they are conscious of this as they are preparing the activity, right? Okay. Support consistent grading. If I'm using the same rubric for all students, then in theory, I'm grading everyone fairly in the same way. It reduces subjective bias, like I mentioned. It facilitates transparent feedback. It helps students to self-monitor. And we can speak in general that we have two kind of general types of rubrics, which are the analytic rubrics and the holistic rubrics. What's the difference? The analytic rubrics are the typical ones that you are probably used to, which have categories and point values. So you might have 5 categories, and each category is worth 4 points. So you have a total of 20 points for that activity. And then you have the names of the categories and the descriptions of each point value, right? This is the analytic rubric. A holistic rubric, on the other hand, is one overall score. It's not as specific as far as its breakdown. It's a general evaluation. Yeah, so I make general comments about the language that the students produced. We tend to prefer to use analytic because they justify our evaluation better, because I can see exactly where I took off how many points on the student's grade, right? Okay, here are a couple sample rubrics for you. So we have a speaking sample and a writing sample. In speaking, I gave 4 criteria for each one, for speaking and for writing. So in speaking, we might consider something like fluency, accuracy, pronunciation, and vocabulary. And you guys can see the details that I include here. We have to be careful about fluency, though, because sometimes fluency is not about not knowing the language. Sometimes we're not fluent in our first language, right? If someone asks me a question in English, for example, and says, Janine, if you were president, what would you do? That's a tough question. I would really have to reflect on that one, right? I would have to think and get thoughts together. And what would I do? What would my priorities be? Ooh, that's hard. So even if I have to answer that in my native language, I might have trouble. Because not because of the language itself, but because of the ideas I'm trying to generate in my native language. You see? Okay, so this would include a 4-point scale with short descriptors for each point value to make sure that I clearly say what makes the difference between getting, for example, a 4 in pronunciation and a 3 in pronunciation. Yeah. I want to emphasize the fact that speaking rubrics should not be the same for every speaking activity, because it really depends on what that activity wants to emphasize. So for example, if I'm doing a class debate with my students on the cost of university education, for example, in high school, like I'm doing a debate with high school students, maybe in my rubric that I create, I don't need to focus so much on something like pronunciation. Maybe my focus in a debate is constructing an argument and a counter argument. So maybe I want to include those components on my rubric, and maybe pronunciation only give 2 points, or not include pronunciation for this activity, depending on what we want to emphasize. However, if I'm doing, for example, the recital of a poem that they have to memorize, or they create their own poem and they recite it out loud, then maybe I want to put more emphasis on pronunciation because it's a poem, right? So I need to take into account what is the purpose of my activity to determine what rubric is the most appropriate for that activity. Writing, the same. Not every writing activity will have the same rubric. It depends on the focus of the activity. But here we can consider categories such as organization. I mean, if it's an essay, we definitely want to talk about organization. But if it's a poem, maybe not. Grammar, vocabulary, for example, cohesion. This is important when we have different sections of a writing, that they all go together well, etc. Right? Please, in the chat, guys, comment if you've used rubrics before. What types of categories have you worked with? In speaking, what things have you evaluated? In writing, what things have you evaluated? Yeah. But in any case, we have to make sure that our rubrics are fair and that they are appropriate for the activity that we are working with. If I ask them to create a poem, or I ask them to create a persuasive essay, the rubrics will not look the same, even though both of those activities are writing. So go ahead and comment on the rubrics that you guys have worked with. If you would like to include some other categories here that I haven't mentioned, there are plenty that we can think of. Please comment in the chat. Okay. So to keep scoring fair, remember, we have to also make sure that our rubrics are reliable. So we need to use clear criteria. We need to train teachers together. If I'm working with the same rubric for all of the teachers in my grade level, for example, we need to make sure that we're using the rubric in a similar way. So we might take a sample speaking activity or a sample writing activity, and among my teachers say, okay, let's all evaluate this activity using this rubric right here and see what scores we get. This is called inter-rater reliability. It means if all of the teachers that evaluate the same activity give scores that are very similar, this is good because that means that the rubric is detailed and it's easy to apply to a speaking or a writing activity. In other words, if I have a group of 4 teachers and the rubric is out of 20 points and my teachers give 17, 18, 18, 19, those 4 scores are very similar. So my rubric is good in its reliability. However, if I have 4 teachers and we all use the same rubric to evaluate the same activity, and I have scores 11, 15, 17, and 20, we have a problem with reliability because everyone is using the rubric quite differently, okay? Whenever possible, we grade blind. What does this mean? That we don't look at the name of the student to make sure that it doesn't influence in the scoring, right? This isn't always possible, but if it is, in some cases, we can grade blind. Use multiple samples to test the rubric. Avoid tasks with cultural bias and pilot assessment tasks with a small group to see how the rubric works, if this is possible. If it's not possible, then we go ahead with the rubric, but maybe in the future we need to make adjustments depending on how the rubric works. Okay, here are some common assessment mistakes to avoid. Yes, before we move on, I want to take a look at a couple of the comments in the chat. So we have, yes, Eliberto says different weighting tables with different rubrics. Absolutely. Martita says she's used rubrics to assess dialogues. Okay, good. And Charo says in rubrics, I also take into account the quality of the slides students use for short lectures. Absolutely. Absolutely, because that's part of their presentation as well. So if they have typos or it doesn't look aesthetically pleasing, we also can evaluate the visuals of a speech. Absolutely. Thank you guys for your comments. Okay. Here are some common assessment mistakes to avoid. Assessing content that was not taught. Again, we have to remember validity and reliability in our assessments. Validity is teaching and testing the same stuff, so to speak, right? So teaching and testing the same material. We can't test on things we haven't taught. Using unclear or unmeasurable outcomes causes a problem, right? We need our outcomes to be pretty clear and able to be measured. Over-reliance on tests. Teachers often give students tests, multiple choice tests. They're fast to grade, they're easy to grade, but this is not the only assessment, and this assessment may not tell us really how well students are doing. Because let's think about multiple choice. If I have 3 options for my multiple choice test for my students, guess what? They have a 33.3% chance of getting it right by just guessing. Right? So we need to be sure that we vary our assessments, not simply tests, and tests. Yeah, giving summative tasks with no preparation. Obviously, it's our job to scaffold and to prepare our students throughout so that they're ready for the summative evaluation. And using rubrics only at the end instead of showing our students earlier. We need to socialize the rubrics with our students so it's clear how we will be evaluating them before they do the activity. Okay, and lastly, some summary kind of best practices for meaningful assessment. Triangulate evidence. So this goes back to the idea that we saw in the previous slide of over-reliance on tests. We can look at different types of evidence to get a better picture of how our students are really doing. So in this case, we can take, for example, 3 sources: observation, a particular product, and a performance on an activity. And this way we triangulate it in the sense that we get a bird's eye view and a better perspective of how our students are really doing, right? Okay. Provide feedback quickly and specifically. Provide feedback in a way that's constructive to students. Build in self and peer assessment. Self-assessment is important for students to reflect, because then if we help them to become aware of where their weaknesses are in English, we can help them to work specifically on those parts, right? Yes. Okay. Peer assessment as well, but remember that if we involve peer assessment, we need to do that part before the teacher assesses, because the teacher is here, right? Whereas the peers are all at the same level. So if we're going to involve peer assessment, we need it to happen before the teacher looks at and assesses the activity. Use exemplars of good performance. For example, here is a good descriptive paragraph. Let's look at the characteristics of this descriptive paragraph so you know what to aim for, what should be your goal, right? Make rubrics available before the task, once again, and this is important. And this last point is particularly important for me as a teacher. You should match your assessment, obviously, with the activities you do in class and also your teaching philosophy. I'm not sure if all of you have a teaching philosophy. Let us know. Let us know if you have a teaching philosophy. Share it in the chat if you do. A teaching philosophy is essential, and maybe we'll do a webinar about teaching philosophies in the future. That would be amazing. Okay. Yeah, if we can, we'll do a webinar about teaching philosophies, but building your teaching philosophy is essential. It's what you believe in as a teacher. For you, what is education? What is a language? What is teaching? What theories do you base your practices in the classroom on? All that stuff. This makes up your teaching philosophy. Yeah. In your teaching philosophy, you probably have some idea of what you believe evaluation and assessment to be. So you apply that in your classroom. In my case, I teach at a university here in Quito, Ecuador, and I teach students linguistics. They're all linguistics majors. And my students know from the first semester that I do not believe in exams, old-fashioned exams. By this, I mean memorizing a lot of information, closing your books, sitting in a test, writing down all the information you remember, answering questions. I don't believe in that way of assessment for my teaching philosophy. Everyone has their own, right? Because I believe that students can really show us more what they're capable of doing if they actually produce something new, something creative. Yes, using the things we've been learning, but produce something of their own. And this has given me, in my particular context, very good results because students are more encouraged to do things. And they don't see it as an exam. They don't see it as this huge stressor. They see it as an opportunity to create something new. For example, in my 3rd semester class this semester, I'm teaching advanced English grammar to my students at university. And I said, okay, guys, for the final exam, we're going to create a mini grammar manual for other Ecuadorian students, university students of other majors. We're going to create a mini manual as your exam. And guess what? If these manuals look good, we're going to send them to a place that I know for them to be published. Suddenly students are motivated. I said, you're going to include your own examples, your original examples, all of this. You're going to create it from scratch by yourselves. But we're going to see if we can send these off to be published. So it's going beyond the simple grade and the evaluation. Yeah. And this motivates students. So for me, this works. But again, you all have your own teaching philosophies and your own particular context, and you can determine what works. But make sure that the activities you do in class mirror the evaluations, and that all of that fits into your own personal teaching philosophy. Okay, that's all I have for you guys today. So thank you so much for joining us in this webinar. I invite you all in about 10 minutes to join me on Zoom. The link will be posted on the Facebook page, the RELO Andes Facebook page right now. So you're welcome to join me to continue discussing this topic. I'm sure you have lots to teach me too. I'm always excited to interact with you. So please join me on the Zoom session in 10 minutes. Thank you once again for joining us today for this month's webinar. I hope it has been beneficial for you, and I will see you next month. Bye, teachers. Take care.